I've decided to start with showing you how you can go about selecting things in the wireframe view, because that's important for when it comes to saving things in the libraries, which is mainly what this video is intended to be about. But we'll start with selection. Okay, if you hit escape, that will take you to the wireframe view, and that's the terrain, and that's the infinite ground plane. If I hit keyboard shortcut 2, that's the overhead view, and you can see here that the infinite plane is just represented by a small grid, and the terrain is in this case represented by a larger grid, and you can see that it's subdivided into more squares. A bit difficult to tell the difference between the two of them just by looking at them from above. Right, if you want to select the terrain, you can just left click on any part of its wireframe like so, and if you left click on the plane, then you can select that. If you want to deselect everything, there's a little control here, you can do select none. However, if you're in a situation where you've got two things overlapping in the wireframe view, you need to hold the control key down and left click, and then you can pick out from this little menu which one of these things you want to select. If you want to select two things, you can hold the shift key down, and supposing you've already got one selected, a left click will select the other thing. If you left click on it again, it will deselect it, and keeping the shift key down, then you can deselect it by a left click. So you can select and deselect using the shift key. Right, the same applies if you've brought this menu up. So hold the control key down and left click, then select what you want, holding the shift key down now. That selects plane 1. Go back to holding the control key down and left click, and then switch to the shift key, and you can select the terrain. So you can select two things together in that way. Final ways of selecting, if you know where the origin is, so in this case it's quite easy because it's the center of these objects, you can left click and drag, so keeping the left button held down, and then when you release it, if it's passed over the origin of each of these objects, then both objects will be selected. Okay, right, that's enough about selection. I'm going to switch back to the perspective camera view, so that's keyboard shortcut 1, and we're looking from the camera, and I'm going to left click on this terrain. Left clicking on the terrain allows me to get access to these little column of symbols, and I'm particularly interested in this case in entering the material lab, because what I want to show you first is how to save a material to the material library. So left click on that little M, and if you pass over any buttons or controls in here, then you'll see a name pops up just here to give you a clue what's what. It can all look a bit daunting at first, particularly since there's like these little very small controls. Okay, this control here is the one we're interested in, and that will take us to the material library. So I'll just left click on that. Alright, I'm going to create a new category for this video. I've already had a few goes at this, you can see, so it'll probably fill up in here. These are all my categories, and you've also got access to more selections here from this little drop down, but we won't go into that. We'll just concentrate on just the basics. So I'm going to add a category for the tutorial. So tutorial cat. I'm going to call it cat because I can't think how to spell category. So I select that category. You can see it's empty, and then click on add. That's my material. So my mount mat, and that's added in there now. That's all you have to do really. You get a preview up here. The only thing to consider is that a lot of materials are dependent on the way they're lit. So if you saved a material to the library and then you bring it out into a different scene with different lighting, it might not look the same. Because if it has, say, ambient, if it's dependent on ambient and there's no ambient in the sky, which I'll show you the global control for that in a second, then it will look quite radically different. So that's just something to be aware of. That's where the ambient control for the material is, and that works with the global ambient of the sky. Sorry, that's a bit of a digression. Let's save another material. So here we go. There's our infinite plane. I'll select the infinite plane, click on M, go into the material library. It's remembered which category we're in, and just go. No, it looks the same. It's probably the same material, but for the purposes of argument, let's add that and go plane material. So if you have two materials which here are the same, you can delete them with this button. The only drawback I would say, and it's not that much of a drawback unless you have materials that rely on huge image textures is that deleting a material like so doesn't free up the space in terms of its memory footprint in the category where it's stored in Bryce. So that's the only thing. You don't save any space memory wise by deleting materials on your hard drive. You have to transfer the materials over to another category if you want to do that. So anyway, that's a minor point. So I've saved a material there since the other one turned out to be the same. And now let us look at adding these objects to the object library. So this plane's selected. We go to this little arrow next to the create button here. We can add our own category again, our cat, and then if there's a little preview here, if you left click on that you can change the view on that preview, which can be useful, and then just add it, and it's given as the name plane 1, and it's up to you if you add a description. Right, and we do the same for the terrain here, so left click on that, and then we can add this. So just click on add because it's remembered the category. It said terrain, and again, a description's optional. Now supposing you wanted to add the terrain and the plane as an object on its own. Well, you think you could just select them both like so and then just go to the library, but you can see from this preview that we've not managed to get the terrain, and the reason for that is that you will only get these things into the object library together if they're grouped, and there's that little G there that groups the objects. So click G, they become a grouped object. Then if you go to the library you can now add them both together. So there we go. So it says group 1, but we could go plane and terrain. So the only thing to bear in mind, and it's the same as it was with the material library, is that if you delete any of the objects from here, though they're deleted from the thumbnails so you don't see them anymore, they still remain in the file. Now it's a little bit more of an issue with the object library because some objects can have a very large memory footprint, and if this category here grows larger than 2 gigabytes, I think it's 2 gigabytes, then it'll break and everything in it will become corrupted and you'll have lost all those objects that you've saved. So that's just something to bear in mind. If you need to check that, you have to figure out your way through the directory structure. So let's have a look here. I've got computer local disk program files -3D Bryce 7. We then go into presets and you can see these are broken down into different folders. So they've got materials, and then you've got the folders for where the categories are stored. So if we go into this one here, then this is the material that we created. There's my tutorial category material. So you can see that's usually materials are fairly small memory footprints. None of those are pushing the limits. If we now go back and go to objects and go into where we installed, then we're down here somewhere, whatever we called it, our category here, that's where the objects are stored in that particular case. If you want to have more of these folders, then you just create a new folder and it will appear in the structure under this little arrow here. Same for the material library, and it will be the same for the sky. We're coming to the sky now. So we've saved the materials, we've saved these objects, and when you save the objects it also embeds the materials in those objects, so you can recover the materials from those objects after you've brought them back in. I'll just ungroup those two so we're back to where we were, and now we'll consider this little arrow here, the sky and fog preset. So if I left click on that, we can add our own category again, the same. So a new cat, and then we can add our sky. So this is whatever it gives. We can choose an appropriate name. In the description here you could add some useful information, but we don't yet know what might be useful information because we don't really know much about the sky. So we could always go back and edit that. So I'll just add this for now without any information, and you'll notice immediately, well I hope you do, that a little H has appeared in the bottom right hand corner, and that is indicating to us that a HDRI image is associated with this sky. Now it does actually figure rather more largely, if that's the right way of putting it, in terms of the memory footprint, this is more of a problem. Okay, let's put it like that, because HDR images can be huge, and it's quite easy to use all your allocated 2 gigabytes up in one category without really noticing. So if I go back to where I was looking before and show you in the folders, if we go to presets again, and there's skies here installed, these can get quite big without much effort if you're using HDRI images. So these are the ones to keep an eye on, really, because if you've got a HDR image and say its memory footprint's around about 34 megabytes, and you can get bigger than that, then saving a few of those is going to start to eat through the of memory available in this category. So that's just something to be aware of, because it's very annoying when a category becomes corrupt and you've lost all the skies that you've been using, and then you have to go back to the files that you'd saved and save them all again. So that's the sky saved. The main consideration with a sky, because it's a lighting entity, is that its effect will change radically depending on the render options. This little button here shows you where the render options are. So left click down here, click on render options, and the things to note is whether you're using regular rendering or whether you're using premium rendering and say true ambience, which is an indirect lighting method. So regular rendering is direct lighting and true ambience is indirect, and the quality of the light that's generated through these methods is fairly radically different, as is the processes which go into gathering that light. So that's just something to be aware of for the future when you get onto more sophisticated rendering models and you're saving your sky. You like a sky, but you also might have to check whether there's soft shadows set, because that'll, if the sun's soft in regular rendering mode, it'll just render soft. In premium effects you have to set this control to make it render soft. The other thing to consider is the maximum ray depth, because that will also affect how fast it renders. So you might find with true ambience renderers, and you've got these couple of controls set, and you might notice this is a lower value, and if you were rendering glass-like materials you might also notice that the total internal reflection is set. So that's less to do with the sky and the lighting, but it is something to be aware of. So in this case it's regular rendering, it's fairly straightforward, so we don't need to worry about adding any details. Now supposing we want to bring things back into the scene and use them. So I'm going to file a new document, don't save, check out there. Right, when you launch a new document you will find yourself with a view somewhat like this. This is the perspective camera. Now if I switch to the overhead view now, keyboard shortcut 2, you'll find it's pointing in a curious direction. Well, I think this is a curious direction because with the sky and fog, this rollerball represents the position of the sun. When the sun's up here, then it's up here, which I think is easier to understand if you move the camera and then rotate it so it's facing what I call north. That just makes it easier to understand where the sun is in all these situations. The sun position here on the rollerball will represent exactly north, east, south, west, straight up. And when in the moon mode, just left click on that to make that work. So long as, I'm going to the Skylab now and I'll show you this, you've not got sun linked to view, otherwise this control then starts relating to the camera position. You'll also notice if you've reset the scene, as in the way I've done, or even if you use the reset sky control, which I'll just show you where that is because it has the same effect on the sky, there, reset sky, go back into the Skylab, the shadow intensity will be set down at 90. It's not really a good idea to have it at anything other than 100 until you know what you're doing. This intensity control is global and it allows light to travel through solid objects. Having it set down was a way of creating the effect of ambient light before true ambience lighting was put in place and got working correctly. Another thing to note here is that this little arrow also allows us to go into the library. So if I left click on this, I can bring this sky preset in, and then all the settings with that sky, including the HDRI image that was saved with that sky, will load in and it'll be ready to use. Keyboard shortcut 1 to switch to the camera view, and then you can see what this looks like in the default scene. Alright, you don't because all the settings for the sky have been brought in, that also means that the control here for the intensity will have been set up because I will have set that up properly. Well, I hope I would have done. Okay, right, what if we want to bring in a sphere? We'll bring in a sphere, default Bryce sphere, just so we've got something in our scene to render now. There we go, and if we want the material for that, click on the M for the material lab and then select the material that we saved in the category. It's remembered which category, either that or you have to seek it out, whichever is appropriate, and that's loaded that in, so you can see that's managed to apply a material, so that's a fairly easy thing to do. If you wanted, instead of this infinite plane, we wanted to bring in something from the create library, so go to the object presets, click on the plane, check out of there, and it looks like it's coming in at the right altitude. So in that case, we've got infinite plane brought in from the object library, we've brought in our sky, we've brought in a default Bryce object, and then we've applied a material to it. Now, a little bit of information about the sky, because we're using HDRI image, which gives us better shadow simulation. You might notice, because of the simplistic nature of this surface here, in fact I'll make it more simple by resetting it to the default grey. That's the reset button there, so just nip into the library and do that. I'll show you again. These bands, which are now far more visible, have taken the material off, are being generated by the simulated light sources that are put in the sky due to image-based lighting. So if we just go into the Skylab here, go to image-based lighting, this quality setting is what determines how many of these light sources are generated. This is its lowest setting. So we'll just go on to render in scene by clicking on this little arrow here. That's very helpful. Turning this up will not increase the quality of this preview. This preview will always show you in its lowest setting. However, this is its default setting when you create a HDRI. Load one in, and you will find that if it's somewhere around that point, the bands will virtually disappear depending on the HDRI image, and the render time will be a little bit longer depending on the complexity of your scene. So that's just one way that you might set the quality of the lighting up for final rendering if you're using a sky with a HDRI image in it, as I was in this example. So I think that's more or less it really. I don't want to go into too much detail about the lighting. I just mostly wanted to cover how you can select objects, how you can save a material to the library, how you can save an object to the library or objects, how you can save skies to the library, and then how you can bring them back afterwards. So there you go. That's the end of the video. I hope you found that interesting and useful, and that it will help you when it comes to using the content that's been provided in the free product that this video is going with.